When I saw the return address on the envelope, my first thought wasn't about Ethan at all. It was about the mail carrier, a woman named Priya, who'd been doing our route for 3 years, and how she must have handled this letter the same way she handled every bill and coupon flyer, with no idea that it was about to knock the air out of somebody's chest. I was standing in the kitchen with my coat still on, keys still in my other hand, and Emma's voice was coming from the living room, asking if we had any of the good crackers left, or if I'd eaten them all again. I told her to give me a minute. Then I sat down at the table, still in my coat, and read the letter twice before I understood it. It wasn't long. It said Ethan wanted to see me. It said he understood if I said no. It said he was sick, and that the word sick was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because he didn't explain what kind, and somehow that made it worse, not better. At the bottom, he'd written his phone number, like I might not still have it memorized after all these years, which I did, though I hadn't dialed it since the divorce was finalized. I sat there long enough that Emma came looking for me. She's 16, tall for her age, with her father's dark eyebrows and my stubborn chin, and she leaned in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression she gets when she already suspects something is wrong and is deciding whether to ask. "You okay?" "Fine," I said, and folded the letter before she could see the handwriting, because even at 16, even after 10 years, I think she still would have known it. That's how it started. Not with a fight, not with a discovery, just a letter and a lie so small I almost didn't notice I'd told it. I should explain, because if you're going to understand any of what came after, you need to understand what our life actually looked like before that letter showed up. I'm 45. I manage the front desk and billing at a dental practice in a town in Ohio that most people have never heard of, which is fine by me because I like knowing the mail carrier's name, and I like that the woman who cuts my hair also cuts Emma's. My sister Kate lives 20 minutes away, and most Sundays we still do dinner together, the three of us, plus her husband Dale and their 2 boys, who treat Emma like an honorary older sister and ask her increasingly complicated Minecraft questions she has stopped pretending to understand. Ethan left when Emma was 6. I want to be precise about that because precision matters in this story more than it usually does in mine. Not left like he walked out one night with a suitcase. It was slower and uglier than that. Months of arguments that Emma was too young to remember clearly, and then, one day, he wasn't at breakfast anymore. And a few weeks after that, the divorce papers were something I signed at our kitchen table, with Kate sitting beside me, holding my free hand. The story I told Emma, when she got old enough to ask real questions, was the story I believed myself. That her father had been unfaithful, that there had been someone else, someone I never named because I genuinely didn't know her name, only that I'd found things. A hotel receipt once, tucked into a jacket pocket I was emptying before the dry cleaner came. Late nights that didn't add up. A kind of guilt that clung to him those last few months, like a smell he couldn't wash off. I never caught him with anyone. I want to be honest about that, too. I built the story out of the pieces I had, and it fit, and it made sense of a man who'd become a stranger in his own house, and it let me be angry instead of confused, which at the time felt like the only way I was going to survive. Ethan never really argued with the story. That's the thing I didn't understand until much later. He let me believe it. He let Emma believe it, in the vague, half-formed way a 6-year-old, and then a 10-year-old, and then a 14-year-old believes anything about a father who sends a birthday card every May and nothing else. For 10 years, that was the whole of him to us. A card in May, sometimes late, always with too much money folded inside for a girl he didn't know anymore. No phone calls, no visits. Once, when Emma was 11, a stiff, awkward voicemail on her birthday that she listened to 4 times and then never mentioned again. And now, a letter. I called Kate before I called him. "Don't," she said, before I'd even finished explaining. "Laura, I'm serious. You spent years getting Emma to a good place about this. You spent years getting yourself to a good place. Whatever he wants, it's not going to be worth blowing that up." "He says he's sick." People say a lot of things when they want back into a life they walked out of. I didn't disagree with her, not out loud, but something in the letter had lodged itself under my skin in a way that ordinary contact from Ethan never had. Maybe it was the handwriting, which had gotten smaller and more careful, an old man's handwriting on a man who wasn't old yet. Maybe it was that single sentence, "I understand if you say no," which didn't sound like the version of Ethan I'd built my anger around. That version wouldn't have understood anything. That version would have shown up assuming forgiveness was owed to him. I told Kate I wasn't going to bring Emma into it yet. I just wanted to see him. Once. To understand what he actually wanted before I decided whether Emma needed to know he existed again. She sighed, in the particular way she has, the one that means she disagrees but has decided the fight isn't worth having. "Just don't go alone to wherever he wants to meet. Meet him somewhere public." I met him at a diner 2 towns over, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in a decade, chosen specifically because it was nowhere either of us had ever taken the other, back when we were an us. He was already there when I arrived, in the back booth, and for a second I didn't recognize him. Ethan had always been a solid presence, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who took up space in a doorway without meaning to. The man in the booth looked like someone had taken that man and left him out in weather for a decade. Thinner, grayer at the temples in a way that had happened all at once, it seemed, rather than gradually. He stood when he saw me, which surprised me, some old reflex of manners neither of us had needed in years, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the table, like 2 people trying to remember a language. "You look good," he said, which was such a strange, small thing to say that I almost laughed. "You look sick," I said, because I was still angry, and being cruel felt like the only power I had left in that booth. He nodded like he'd expected it, like he'd earned it, and sat back down. We ordered coffee we didn't drink. He told me about the diagnosis in careful, clinical language, like he'd rehearsed it, which he probably had. Treatment was starting in a few weeks. The prognosis wasn't a death sentence, he said, but it wasn't nothing either, and there would be a period where he might not have the strength to fight for anything he wanted, including this. "Including what, exactly?" I asked. "Emma," he said. "I know I don't have a right to ask. I know what I look like showing up now, after everything." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, a habit I remembered from a decade ago that made something twist unpleasantly in my chest. "I'm not asking you to explain me to her. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just don't want to run out of time without at least trying." "You had 10 years to try." "I know." "You had 10 years, Ethan. And you sent a card every May with too much cash in it, like that made up for it." I stopped myself, because my voice had gotten loud enough that the waitress glanced over, and because I didn't actually want to finish that sentence in a diner with strangers listening. He didn't defend himself. That was what struck me most, sitting there. The Ethan I remembered from the end of our marriage had been defensive about everything, quick with excuses that never quite held together. This man just sat there and absorbed it, like he'd decided in advance that whatever I said, he wasn't allowed to argue. And then, almost as an aside, trying to explain why he'd stayed away so long, he said something that didn't fit. "I thought if I stayed close, you'd have kept." He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words, and finished differently than he'd started. "I thought it was better for both of you if I just disappeared clean. Simpler than trying to explain everything to a kid." Explain everything. Not explain what happened, not explain the affair. I noticed it the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you know by heart. Not enough to stop the song, but enough that it stays with you after. I told him I needed time to think about whether Emma should know he'd reached out at all, let alone whether she should see him. He nodded, said that was fair, and didn't push. When I stood to leave, he said one more thing. "For what it's worth, Laura, I never blamed you for how you told it. The story, I mean. About why I left. I didn't understand what he meant by that until much later. At the time, I filed it away as one more piece of a conversation that had left me more unsettled than I'd expected, and drove home with the radio off, going back over every word. I didn't tell Emma that week. I told myself I was protecting her, and maybe I was, but if I'm being honest with you the way I'm trying to be honest with myself, I was also protecting the version of events I'd built for both of us. The one where Ethan was simply the man who left, uncomplicated in his failure, easy to be angry at. Instead, I went to see Margot. Ethan's mother and I had never been close in the way mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law sometimes are in stories, but we'd never been enemies either. After the divorce, she'd sent a card of her own each Christmas, addressed to Emma, and I'd always let it through, because whatever had happened between her son and me, I didn't see the use in punishing a woman for loving her granddaughter from a distance. She lived alone now, in the same small house on Willow Street where Ethan grew up, and when I showed up unannounced on a Tuesday evening, she opened the door already looking like she knew why I'd come, which told me something before I'd said a word. "He wrote to you," she said, not a question. "He wants to see Emma." Margot stepped back to let me in, and I watched her hands as she did it. She'd always had a habit of wringing them when she was nervous, a habit Ethan had inherited without either of them noticing, and she was doing it now, twisting the hem of her cardigan. "Sit down, Laura." She made tea neither of us wanted, the way people do when they need something to do with their hands. "What did he tell you?" "That he's sick. That he wants a chance to know her before." I didn't finish it. "Margot, what am I missing? Because he said something at that diner that didn't sit right, and you're looking at me right now like there's something you'd rather not say." She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer at all. Then she set down her tea, untouched, and said, "You never asked me, all those years ago, why he left. You built your own reasons and none of us corrected you, and I think that was a mistake. But it wasn't mine to fix. It was his story to tell, if he ever wanted to." "There was someone else," I said. "I found things. A hotel receipt." "There was a hotel," Margot said carefully. "But there wasn't a woman, Laura. Not the way you think." I remember the kitchen went very quiet after that. Not silent, there was a clock somewhere and the refrigerator humming, but quiet in the way a room gets when you realize you've been standing on ground that was never as solid as you thought. "Then what," I said, "was it?" She looked at me for a long moment like she was deciding something, and then she said, "That's not mine to tell you either. But I think it's past time somebody did, and it should be him. Ask him properly, Laura, not what he's sick with. Ask him what he was so ashamed of that he let you believe the worst thing about him instead." I didn't call Ethan that night, or the next. I sat with it instead, the way you sit with a bruise you don't remember getting, pressing on it occasionally just to see if it still hurts. What finally moved me wasn't anger or even curiosity, though there was plenty of both. It was a box. Ethan had left a few things behind when he moved out, boxed up in the crawl space above the garage. Things I'd never had the heart to throw away and never had a reason to open. Old PAX documents mostly, a few photo albums from before Emma was born, a couple of trophies from a softball league he'd played in during his 20s. I went up there one Saturday while Emma was at Kate's, telling myself I was finally clearing space, and telling myself something else entirely if I was honest, which was that I wanted to understand the man in that diner booth, and I thought maybe the boxes would help. Near the bottom of the second box, under a stack of tax returns from the mid-2000s, I found a manila folder that didn't belong with the rest. Inside were letters. Not love letters, nothing like that. Collection notices, a letter from a bank about a defaulted personal loan, statements from an account I'd never known existed, one that had been opened and closed within the same 18 months, the balance sliding steadily towards zero in withdrawals that had no explanation attached to them, no memo, nothing but dates and amounts. $11,000. Then another 4. Small amounts pulled again and again, the way water erodes stone. Not all at once, but relentlessly, until what was left of our savings, the account we'd told each other was for Emma's college, back when she was still small enough to believe her parents were permanent, had been reduced to almost nothing in the year before Ethan left. I sat on the garage floor with that folder in my lap for a long time. There was a receipt in there, too, from a casino 2 hours from where we used to live, dated 8 months before the divorce. Not a hotel receipt for an affair, a receipt for a room he'd stayed in alone, or at least alone in the sense that mattered, chasing something that had nothing to do with another woman and everything to do with a hole he couldn't stop trying to fill. I understood, sitting there, why he'd let me believe what I believed. An affair was a story with a villain in it, clean and simple, the kind of failure a man could survive being known for. A gambling problem that had eaten through his family's savings while his daughter slept down the hall. That was a different kind of shame. That was the kind of shame you might let a woman believe was infidelity instead, if infidelity felt somehow more forgivable than the truth. I thought about all the late nights I'd cataloged as evidence of another woman. I thought about the business trips that had gotten more frequent that last year. I thought about how, after he left, I'd never once had to explain a debt collector's call to Emma, never once had my credit affected, and I'd always assumed that was because whatever he'd done, he'd at least done it quietly enough not to touch us. It hadn't occurred to me, not once in 10 years, that the reason nothing touched us afterward was that he'd already spent it all before he left, and had simply let me believe the wound was a different shape than it was. I called him that night. He picked up on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for the phone to ring for 10 years and had finally stopped believing it would. "I found the folder," I said. "No hello. The bank statements, the casino receipt." There was a long silence on the line. When he spoke, his voice had changed, some of the careful composure from the diner gone out of it. "I wondered if you ever would." "You let me think there was another woman." "I never said there was," he said quietly. "I just didn't correct you when you assumed it. It was easier. God, Laura, it was so much easier to let you hate me for something ordinary than to tell you I'd gambled away Emma's college fund and couldn't stop, even when I knew what it was costing us. An affair, you get to hate the other woman too. What I did, there wasn't anyone else to blame. Just me, choosing it, over and over, even when I knew." 10 years, Ethan. You let our daughter grow up thinking her father cheated on her mother. I know. His voice cracked on it just slightly. I've hated myself for a lot of things, but that one most of all. I told myself I was protecting her from something worse. I'm not sure that's true. I think I just couldn't stand to say it out loud. I didn't forgive him that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be a lie to tell you the phone call fixed something that 10 years had broken. But something did shift, sitting there in my kitchen with the folder open on the table in front of me. The story I'd told myself, the simple one, the one where he was just a man who'd wanted someone else more than he wanted us, had been wrong in a way that made the whole shape of my anger feel unfamiliar, like a coat that no longer fit the same way across the shoulders. "What do you want me to do with this?" I asked him, now that I know. "I don't know," he said. I've spent 10 years hoping I'd never have to answer that question, and now I'm sick, and I'm running out of time to keep avoiding it. A pause. I'd like the chance to tell Emma myself. Not the whole thing, maybe, but enough that she doesn't keep believing something about me that isn't even true before she has to decide whether to know me at all. Telling Emma was harder than either conversation with Ethan had been. I waited until a Saturday when we had the whole day ahead of us with nothing scheduled, and I told her at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd read that first letter with my coat still on. I didn't give her the whole folder's worth of detail. Some of it felt like it belonged to Ethan to tell if he got the chance, and some of it felt like more than a 16-year-old needed to carry about a father she barely knew. But I told her the shape of it, that there hadn't been another woman, that her father had struggled with something he was ashamed of and had let both of us believe a different story because the true one felt worse to say out loud. Emma sat very still while I talked, in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Ethan in that diner booth. "So you lied to me," she said when I finished, not accusing exactly, working something out. "I told you what I believed was true," I said. "I didn't know the rest, Em, not until a few weeks ago." "But you let me be mad at him for the wrong reason, for 10 years. "Yes," I said, because there wasn't a version of that answer that made it smaller than it was. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at her hands on the table, and when she finally looked up, there were tears standing in her eyes that hadn't quite fallen yet. "I used to make up stories about her," she said, "the other woman. I gave her a name once, in like 6th grade. Melissa. I used to imagine what she looked like." She laughed, a short, unhappy sound. "That's so stupid." "It's not stupid," I said. "You needed a shape for it. I did too." "Does he want to see me?" "He does. He asked. He said it's your choice, whatever you decide." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, an old habit from when she was small, and asked the question I'd been waiting for since the letter first arrived. "Is he going to die?" "I don't know," I told her honestly. "The treatment has a good chance. Nobody can promise more than that." She nodded slowly, like she was filing the answer away somewhere careful, and then she said, "I want to see him. Not because he's sick. I don't want it to be about that. I want to know him instead of the story about him." The meeting happened 2 weeks later at Kate's house because Emma said she wanted somewhere that felt like ours and not somewhere new. I sat in the kitchen with Kate while it happened, close enough to hear if something went wrong, far enough to let it be theirs. It wasn't a movie reunion. There were no tears in the first minute, no embrace that undid 10 years in a single motion. From what Emma told me afterward, they mostly talked about small things at first: her school, a book she was reading, the fact that he still remembered she used to be scared of the dark, which surprised her because she'd forgotten he would have known that at all. At some point, she asked him directly about the gambling, and he answered her plainly, the way I imagine he'd wished. For 10 years, someone had let him answer me. She told me later that he cried when he apologized, which she hadn't expected, and that it had made her feel strange. Not forgiving exactly, but something adjacent to it, something she said she didn't have a word for yet. "He's not what I imagined," she told me that night, sitting on the edge of my bed the way she used to when she was small and couldn't sleep. "I don't know if I like him yet, but I don't hate him the way I thought I did. I think I hated the story more than I hated him." I understood that better than I let on. Ethan started treatment a few weeks after that first meeting. I won't tell you it went perfectly, because it didn't. There were setbacks, a difficult stretch in the middle where Emma came home from a visit quieter than usual and didn't want to talk about it for a few days. But he kept showing up, in the small, ordinary ways that matter more than grand gestures ever do. Phone calls that weren't just birthday voicemails. A visit every few weeks once he had the strength for it. Slowly, carefully, something that wasn't quite a relationship yet, but was no longer nothing. As for Ethan and me, people ask sometimes whether finding out the truth changed things between us in that other way, whether there was some door left open now that the story had changed shape. I understand why they ask. It would make a tidier ending. But that door had been closed a long time before the letter ever arrived. Closed by 10 years of silence and a marriage that had already worn itself down to nothing well before the divorce made it official. What we have now isn't a marriage trying to find its way back to itself. It's two people who share a daughter, learning, slowly, how to tell each other the truth instead of the story that's easier to live with. I think about that diner booth sometimes, the version of Ethan who sat across from me, absorbing every accusation without a word of defense. And I understand him differently now than I did that day. He wasn't being humble. He was being a man who'd spent 10 years believing he deserved whatever anger came his way, for reasons he'd never let me see clearly enough to be angry about the right thing. Emma still doesn't know the whole of it. Some of the specifics, I think, are his to share with her when and if he chooses, on his own time, not mine to hand over all at once. But she knows enough now to have stopped inventing women named Melissa, to have stopped carrying an anger that was never quite pointed where it should have been. Sometimes I think the real lie in our marriage wasn't the affair I imagined. It was the silence that let me imagine it in the first place, his and mine both, in our different ways, each of us choosing the version of the story that was easier to survive. I don't know how much time Ethan has. Nobody does, not really, not for any of us. But I know that whatever time is left, Emma is spending some of it with a father who is, finally, telling her the truth instead of letting her write it herself. That, I've come to think, might be the only kind of ending a story like this is entitled to. Not a happy one, necessarily, just an honest one, arrived at late, but arrived at all the same.